Frankie and I have been searching for an answer.
Yes, we have. But this time, we actually know what the question is.
The question is, why do people listen to the Digital Watches Are a Pretty Neat Idea podcast?
I've listened to it once, and the prospect of listening to it all over again,
God forbid,
quite frankly, gives me the screaming heebie-jeebies, you know what I mean?
We've got to have a strong product. We've got to have an answer that sounds good.
It might be that when it comes right down to it, this podcast is being run by a bunch of maniacs.
Hi there, and welcome to Digital Watches Are a Pretty Neat Idea. This is Bryan, and I'm with my friend Jeff, and we'll be talking about Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in all its forms. But before we do that, let's listen to a message from one of our proud sponsors.
This episode of Digital Watches Are a Pretty Neat Idea is brought to you by That Old Jank Spirit. That Old Jank Spirit, as immortalized in the lyrics of that ancient Orion mining song, recited for us here by Eccentrica Golumbitz, the far-famed triple-breasted whore of Eroticon 6.
Oh, don't give me none more of that old jank spirit. No, don't give me none more of that old jank spirit. For my head will fly, my tongue will lie, my eyes will fry, and I may die. Won't you pour me one more of that sinful old jank spirit?
Hello, this is Jeff. This is the section I like to call What in Life, the Universe, and Everything Are They Talking About? This is where I will summarize everything we are talking about this episode. The last we knew, our heroes may have died hiding behind an exploding computer. It turns out that computer was a hyperspatial field generator that blew a hole through the space-time continuum, and they dropped through like a stone through a wet paper bag. That moved them in time far into the future while they remained in the same location. They ended up confused and disoriented at the restaurant at the end of the universe. They confused it for the afterlife. Once they all had their wits about them, they ordered drinks and sat down for dinner. Marvin called them from the car park, and they all went down to meet him. In the car park, Ford and Zaphod admired the ships and chose a sleek black one to steal. Choosing that ship was a bad decision because they discovered they were in mortal danger and attempted to flee. Ford and Arthur improbably end up on another ship. Again, they are immediately apprehended. However, when they are brought to the captain this time, instead of being read torturous poetry and thrown off the ship, they are offered gin and tonics. Ford and Arthur ask to be dropped off at the nearest planet. They are told they can't do that. They find out they are on Ship B of the Golga Frincham Ark Fleet. That ship was used to rid Golga Frincham of a useless third of their population and was scheduled to crash at their destination any time now. On the planet, Ford and Arthur discover Slarty Bartfast's signature on a glacier and realize they are on prehistoric Earth. They also notice the cavemen are dying out since they arrived. Therefore, Arthur is descended from the Golga Frinchams, and the computer program being run by Earth is now most likely corrupt. Whatever happens to be in Arthur's brainwave pattern is most likely the incorrect question. Arthur and Ford run a test to see and find out that it is corrupt. Or is it? Hey Brian, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Jeff. How are you?
Well, I seem to have this pain in all the diodes down my left side.
All right. So I get that.
The first thing I wanted to talk about in this podcast is something that came to me while listening to the last one we just did.
Okay.
One of the points that I made was how I liked on the LP when they were doing the improbability calculation that Eddie was doing them in the background. And the moment Trillian was introduced and walked into the room, he went, probability complete. Like that was the last piece of data that pushed the improbability of everything that happened to infinity. But it wasn't, because there was a whopping smack of probability that had not been calculated yet, which is Trillian owned the mice that happened to be on the Heart of Gold that went to Magrathea. So to me, that is a whopping bit of improbability that had not been calculated yet and needed to be to push it to infinite. So I liked the joke, but it was a little bit early.
Well, that's interesting, because there is something there that I think it's in the radio show, and I'm going to go back to last week's episode and say that one of the things that Trillian points out is that the entire process of them getting to Magrathea had been manipulated from the beginning. And if you recall, of course, the mice were with Trillian all the way through the story. So yes. The mice, in my opinion, are the reason that Zaphod stole the ship, and the mice took the ship to Magrathea. That was their plan.
Yes.
So they were manipulating Trillian and Zaphod. I can agree that it's part of the improbability cycle that they're going through, but they actually intended to get there. That was they needed to get there in order to create the world, the second, Earth 2.
They needed a ride
so
to Magrathea.
They could restart the process. So, exactly. So they were the ones manipulating Zaphod and Trillian to actually make that trip happen.
Yes, they did mention that, but to me, that all still has to figure into the improbability calculation.
100%.
In the radio series, it was never completed, but in the LP, they did and this was the final piece. I liked this joke, and then I'm like, no, but it was wrong. But that was last time. This time, we're going to be talking about Primary Phase Part 2. So these are going to be the last two episodes 5 and 6. The same basic story is represented on the single LP of The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy Part 2. And again, still wanted to do these simultaneously rather to do the LP on their own. But this time, though, there's this section that did a total rewrite and is substantially different than the radio show, but happens to be the same as the book. So again, I like that we're doing these together, and I'm really on the fence of which of these two versions is better.
Yes. I think that we're looking at a situation where, like you said before in the last podcast, that there may be some combination of the two that makes it for a better story.
I'm still, like I said, on the fence about which of the two versions I like better, but the performances of the actors was much better in the radio series than it was on the LP this time. The LP just seemed more like a read than a performance. So I really like the way they did it in the radio series.
Right.
All right. So we are going to start out with episode 5, and they start out this episode with a monologue, and they're doing a history of the universe and everybody's search for meaning. They threw in as much ridiculousness as they possibly could, from the universe being sneezed out by the great green arkle seizure to a race of small blue creatures with more than 50 arms who invented deodorant before the wheel. And all of this was done just to remind us that 2 computers were built to find the answer and then the question of the meaning of life, the universe, and everything.
It's funny because I've always wondered why he decided that the Jack Travarded people, the ones that created the Great Green Arkle Seizure, why they had 50 arms. Is that what he says?
Yes.
50 arms?
He actually says more than 50
and
arms.
That more than 50 arms, right? And that they were the first ones to create the spray deodorant.
Yeah, aerosol deodorant before the wheel.
But what was funny to me is, well, why would that make them think of sneeze and sneezing out of the world or the universe? You know what? And then I just sitting here thinking about it, I'm thinking, well, yeah, they probably had pretty bad BO, so maybe they just stunk so bad that's why they were so sensitive to smell.
Yeah, well, that's why I called it as much ridiculousness, because I couldn't figure out what the Arkell seizure sneezing out the world to these little creatures with more than 50 arms. I couldn't put a parallel, but yes, I think a lot of BO that could do it.
So in reviewing this information, I was looking into it because I thought Arkell seizure. What could he possibly be thinking of here in terms of that phrase? You know, where did this phrase come from? And I first thought it had something to do with the sneeze, but then when I looked it up, I found that the closest parallel seemed to be arc de cercle seizure. And people may be familiar with that because there are folks who suffer from this, have their backs are arched and their feet are bent. And I don't know whether he used this as the precursor to a sneeze, but that was the closest thing I could come to that. So I'm not sure whether he used that as a reference to create this word, but Arkell seizure appears to be his own word.
Yes, I think that he found this term for this epileptic seizure and decided that he was going to create a fictitious being based on that because it sounds like a sneeze, though it's really not a sneeze. But it's another one of those, like you said, the wordplay that they use. It's tremendous.
Right.
The last we knew, they were all crouched behind a computer bank, and it was being shot at and absorbing energy, and then it explodes.
So the next thing that happens for the group is that they wake up or become aware of where they are, and they have a little discussion about what it's like to be dead, or in their minds they think they're dead.
Yes.
And then a gentleman walks up to them and starts speaking with them.
In comparing the radio series and the LP, like I said, I really like the performances in the radio series. The first difference that I've noticed is in the timing of the actors. When they first arrive at the restaurant that you're talking about, and they meet this guy, and it's this waiter, he asks them if they want drinks. He's ignored by everybody, but Zaphod remembers hearing something important, and he wants to get back around to it.
Right.
On the radio series, he very clearly asks them to order drinks, and there's no way they could have missed it.
Mm-hmm.
On the LP,
right,
Zaphod talks right over him in the middle of his sentence, and you actually have to go back and listen carefully to actually hear him say drinks. So it's very likely that they would have not heard them. In both versions, Zaphod wants to go back and rehear what everybody just said to find out what he missed. In the radio series, Trillian asks if it was about the chandelier she pointed out. And Zaphod goes to the waiter and then asks the waiter if he said something about drinks. Like, it's a little flat. But on the LP, it is actually done better. Zaphod asks each of them what they said. Trillian said they were standing up as opposed to lying dead. Zaphod's like,
right.
No. Arthur told him he thought it was more of an après-vis. And Zaphod says, don't you wish you hadn't? and then Ford said it was odd. Zaphod's like, yeah, shrewd, but dull. Then he says, that leaves the little weird fellow. And the waiter asks, me? And Zaphod says, yeah, speak to me. And that's when he finds out about the drinks.
Right after that's when Zaphod says one of my favorite lines there. He says to the guy, put your analyst on danger money, baby.
Yes. Yeah. But so exactly. So there is so much more that helps us get to know who these characters are and reinforces the relationship each of them have.
Mm-hmm.
So again, the LP for me has the better writing, where they've expanded on the original idea that they started with in the radio series, which shows the progression that eventually becomes the book. I talked about the LP having better scripting, but the radio series having better performances. And here is where I noticed it really for the first time. The waiter said that after drinks, the universe would explode for their pleasure. They still don't know where they are yet, and Ford's like, what type of drinks do you serve here? And the waiter said that Ford misunderstood. And Ford's like, I hope not. So for me, Ford delivers both of his lines better in the radio series than on the LP. They find out they're at Milliway's, which is the restaurant at the end of the universe, and they describe it. And we are all told all of the impossible things about eating there. Then they tell us the advertising slogan that they use, which is, if you've done 6 impossible things today, why not round it off with breakfast at Milliway's? I'm not sure how I feel about that whole... It's like it's making fun of itself for writing something so ridiculous. The only thing that I liked was that you could deposit a penny in your time, and then by the time you got to the restaurant, the compound interest would pay the exorbitant cost of the meal. That is the one thing that was not impossible. But the whole meeting yourself and all of that was a little bit kind of strange.
Right. Yeah, that's a little bit of a stretch. And the other thing that I've always thought was odd, and I can't quite figure this out, but they do say breakfast.
Yes.
And it always bothers me that they say breakfast at Milliway's, because to me, if you're going to go, and they even mentioned a little later on, of course, that they can go to the Big Bang Burger Chef for the, beginning of the universe.
Yes.
And you would think to me, or at least I would, that if you're going to the beginning, you would have breakfast at the Burger Chef and dinner at Milliway's.
Yes.
And of course, when they're talking about the meal as it expands in the book and stuff, it's definitely more dinner-like. The other thing that I thought was interesting, and we talked a little bit about this actually in the wrap-up of last episode when we were talking about what day is it. And I thought back a little bit about that, because at one point, I think they're circling the planet of Magrathea, and Trillian says it's about to become dawn on the planet. And then later, Arthur he's relating to Marvin, how incredible the sunsets were, because there were 2 suns setting in the west, or, well, we will assume it's the west in this particular case.
Right.
I wonder, is the day that much shorter?
Yeah,
on Magrathea? So we have lost a sense of whether they're in the same day or where they're at. I always think it's weird because, well, I'm sure we're going to get into the whole concept of multiverse and that kind of thing. So let's just roll along.
As for your dawn and your sunset, it could all be perspective.
Absolutely.
When you're orbiting a planet, you could watch a dawn. But depending on where you land, you could watch a sunset. So it is theoretically possible to see both of them minutes apart.
Right, except that they're orbiting the planet when she mentions dawn, and Arthur is on the planet while he's seeing sunset.
Right. I'm not going to argue about this, but when they're looking at the planet from the other side of the sun while they're orbiting it, they can watch the sun emerge. And they can call that dawn because the sun is emerging from behind the planet. And then as they circle the planet and land, they land in a place on the planet just before the sun sets.
Yes, that's clearly what they've done.
One of the things that I really liked in this is that they include this little piece with Ford trying to explain how Milliway's works and how they're going to survive the end of the universe by being in a time bubble. Like anybody who has ever explained anything in a restaurant, he starts arranging all of the spoons and the forks and the drinking glasses to better demonstrate what he's talking about, and it all goes wrong. People are mad that they're taking his fork and he knocks over a glass, but I don't know if I've ever been in a restaurant that somebody has explained something without lining up forks and spoons.
Nope, that's the way it works.
Yeah. And like any big event or some kind of like a sporting event, they always have groups. And so he starts doing the acknowledgement of all of the different groups who have come, hey, a big shout out to the group of minor deities from Asgard. And there's like a ruckus over there. The LP mentions a hammer.
Right.
Well, that refers to Thor. And Thor's not a minor deity from Asgard. I don't like that there's a hammer. In the radio series, there's just a ruckus, and he's like, ow, that hurts. But they do say minor deities from Asgard, and he mentions, hey, is that your hammer, or something like that.
Oh, but you're forgetting the reference to scale here. Of course, this is the universe, that they're talking about. And if you think about it, those gods, if they existed for the planet Earth, and the Earth no longer exists. So are they major or are they minor?
I guess that is a true point. Again, it's a way of thinking about it that I've never had before. Another group is the Young Conservatives from Sirius B, which is the Dog Star. And in the radio series, they do a much better job of making barking and dog noises where you actually know that they're dogs. And then there's quite a bit of poking fun at the believers of the second coming of the great prophet Zarquan. And those were a lot of cheap jokes at the believers' expenses who turned out to be right.
Yes, 8 seconds, is it before, or 12 seconds before?
Somewhere around that, yes. Here is where Marvin phones them at their table, and they finally discover that Milliways is built on the planet Magrathea. When Arthur says that they have traveled in time but not in space, Zaphod, having no patience for anything Arthur ever says, shuts him down immediately. And the waiter says, your monkey has it right. It seems that everybody, everywhere he goes, makes fun of him for his evolutionary history. So, of course, he says to the waiter, who are you calling a monkey? And then, again, for me, the radio series did a much better job of portraying that line.
Yes. They get a phone call from Marvin, and there's a little interchange with the waiter, and they're surprised that they even get a phone call. But it turns out Marvin's been waiting for them for some millions and millions of years because he never left the planet when they went ahead in time. As they're leaving the table, one of my favorite jokes in the radio show on this episode is when Arthur says, what about my pears Galumbit?
Yeah. I'm guessing there are 3 pairs.
I guess that would be appropriate.
Yes. It's so subtle. And they don't hardly even talk about Eccentrica. So I don't even know.
I know.
If you would catch it, not knowing.
Right.
I guess she is mentioned once.
I don't know how this fits in, but let me try this. One of the things they mention, they talk about a cereal box, where they use the cereal box to outline the details of the universe.
Yes. And
one of the things they talk about is the banking industry and the exchangeable currencies that are available. And they mention the gigantic pew, the Flavium Pavel beads, and what was the other one? The
Altarian dollar.
Altarian dollar, right. And they said that the Altarian dollar had just become devaluated. And here they say, they talk about the pew, the exchange rate of 6 ningies to 1 pew is certainly easy to understand. But of course, a ningi is a large rubber coin that's 600 miles, or what is it? 600 miles on one side?
Yes, it's a
large triangular coin that's 600 miles on one side.
Yes.
And banking people say, but they won't deal with the ningi because it's fiddling small change.
Yeah, so you've got this fiddling small change, but it's a giant rubber coin 600 miles on each side.
Oh, I like that line. I thought it was pretty funny.
Forget about that watches and safe and the others. That was my favorite. You were talking about Marvin being stuck there literally until the end of time. And when Trillian was talking about everything that they have been through, including being blasted. She says 576,000 years, but it's got to be 576 million years through time. Marvin's like, it's all right for you. I had to go the long way around. So
Exactly. And of course, there, while Marvin is there, that's when he makes the comment that he can read the brainwaves, because we were talking about the question being in Arthur's mind.
Yes.
And he tells everybody that he can read the brainwaves, and he knows the question. And of course, just like you mentioned before with the parallels between TV and drama and all that kind of stuff, he keeps delaying and delaying and delaying the answer until something else happens, and of course the whole group goes on, and he makes his comment, I could tell you weren't really interested.
Yes. But he had every chance to tell them.
Yes. But there's also this change in this particular part where they start talking about the book again.
This is where the story got a total rewrite. Let's talk about the first version. So we'll talk about the radio version first, and then we'll go back and do a couple of changes that they made for the LP that is in the book. Last episode, you were mentioning how important Marvin is into the whole Hitchhiker's universe. In both of the versions we listened to, they are reunited with Marvin, and Marvin helps them steal a ship, which we're just about to talk about. But when they first got there, they were all so happy to see Marvin again, which seems strange because they were totally sick and tired of him when they abandoned him on Magrathea. So for him, billions of years have gone by, but for them, it's just been moments. So I'm sure that Marvin was on the Heart of Gold when they stole it. He's not been a companion of theirs for very long.
No.
Zaphod stole the ship. He stole Marvin right along with it.
Right. Marvin was part of the ship's complement. He was one of the serious cybernetic robots that was part of the Heart of Gold ship.
So why do you think they went from hating him so much, they abandoned him on Magrathea, to being so happy to see him when they were reunited?
It's a good question. I really don't know. I guess it's kind of makes some continuity. Maybe that's the only thing I could think of. Is like, they've been thrown into this situation and they're like, oh, wait a minute, what the heck's going to happen next? And they're like, oh, look, one of our old friends. Maybe we can make all this work after all. I don't know. That seems to be the only logical thing I could think of.
I've got two different theories. The one being the practical one is that Marvin was a very minor character who tested very well, and the writers decided, wait, we need to do more with Marvin because he's the one everybody likes. The other thing is the last being in the world or the universe that they expected to run into at that restaurant because of its whopping improbability would have been Marvin. So just the sheer shock of Marvin being there made it exciting to them. But I just found a very disconnect between how much they hated him and how happy they were to hear that he was at the restaurant. So now we're going to talk about stealing a ship. They meet Marvin, who's in the car park, and Ford and Arthur are just admiring all of the ships that are parked there. And they find this black one that is so black you can hardly even see it, and it's frictionless, and they decide they want to steal it. So they get Marvin to help them steal the ship. In the radio series, the first version, they've stolen an admiral's flagship. And the race of beings are rapidly evolving creatures. They wanted to find out who these creatures were, so they asked the book, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, and you get to hear the description. Part of the description said that if they were at lunch and one of them couldn't reach a coffee spoon, it would evolve into something with longer arms, but that was probably incapable of drinking coffee. Now, Arthur does a really great joke, because as these creatures are evolving, and I want to talk a little bit about that whole scene too, the Admiral had evolved into a chair that they were using, And Trillian looked at the chair and commented that she would prefer a chair with longer arms. Arthur said, but would probably be incapable of drinking coffee. And nobody seemed to get the joke. How could Arthur tell a joke that went over everybody's head?
Oh gosh, I don't know, but that scene was pretty funny. The one. I mean, I don't know if you're going to go right on into what goes on as that chair continues to mutate, or go back over some other. I want to
go back over the details of the evolution of the chair, so to speak. So, do you want to do that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, here's what I'll add at this point.
Okay.
While they are in the ship, they're communicating with they are the flagship, so they're communicating with the rest of the fleet. And they don't understand why, even though 3 of them have shown their face on the monitor, why the rest of the fleet hasn't recognized that there is a problem. And of course, then that's when they realize that the mutations of the creatures, they're expected to be different every time you look at them.
Yes, because Marvin explained who they were.
Right. And when Trillian is looking at the commander of the fleet, she mentions that the commander looked like a pair of size 9 chucker boots.
Yes.
And I just love the line that Arthur, again, I think it's Arthur, says, how did you know they were size 9?
Right.
And of course, we don't get an answer, but I still think that's pretty dang funny.
Yes, it is. Something else that I found hysterical is that when the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy book that they were listening to about the description of that race of creatures, the rest of the universe was non-evolving like they were. And they refer to them as filthy, rotten, stinking samelings. So people who don't evolve are filthy, rotten, stinking samelings.
Right.
So the Admiral, who was a chair, was now evolving into the ravenous bug bladder beast of Troll, and I think a Vogon grandmother. I mean, it was both, because they were calling back a line from the first episode in the description of Vogons.
Right. Right.
Ford and Arthur get away in escape pod, and that they notice that the other escape pod is gone. So like, oh no, we've just left them, and there's nothing that we can do. And then Ford lets Arthur know that when you dish somebody in space, you don't talk about them, and you just get blind drunk about them later.
Mm-hmm.
The other 3, Trillian, Zaphod, and Marvin, are presumably eaten by the ravenous bug bladder beast of Troll. That was my bug bladder beast of Troll imitation. Actually, it would have been that Admiral who evolved into the bug bladder beast impression.
That's correct.
In that exchange, Marvin says, I just want to die. So that's just letting you know that he's lived for billions of years in one place waiting for these guys to come back. So, and I think he even lost an arm.
And then later on, right before we cut to Ford and Arthur, you can hear it in the radio show. It just kills me. It's you can hear Marvin saying, "Oh, this ennui is overpowering."
I think that we both laugh more at some of those subtle little add-ons than the great big punchline jokes. That's how Ford and Arthur get separated on the radio series. But the LP is totally different. And for this, we're going to jump back to the restaurant, because there's a scene in the restaurant that we didn't talk about because it wasn't in the radio series. And that is Ford going up to talk with this rock star named Hot Black Desiato. Do you want to talk about that scene?
I don't have too many notes on it, except I do have one note on it. So Ford walks up to Hot Black and he starts talking to him, and he's basically rattling off a monologue because there's no response from Hot Black. And at one point he says to Hot Black, "And you said you didn't want to be a star because you despise the star system."
Yes.
And I thought that was a pretty good line.
Yeah. But now you buy star systems. This is a man that buys star systems. But Hot Black's got this bodyguard, and the bodyguard to me had the best lines. He's like, hey, kid,
Mm-hmm.
who are you? Hey, Ford's like, I'm his best bud from long ago or whatever. He's like, well, I'm Hot Black's bodyguard, and I'm here to protect his body, and I'm not here to protect your body. So you better remove it before it gets damaged. So that to me said everything you needed to know.
Right. I'm kind of at a loss because I'm not sure which of these two versions I like better. I know that the book goes on to work with the Hot Black scene.
Yes.
And of course that does give some foil for Ford to make some jokes and the ship. But I kind of liked the way the Admiral flagship scene works out better than I like the way the Hot Black ship works out.
Yes, and like I mentioned in the beginning, I'm on the fence of which of the two versions is better. I think they could have stuck with the Admiral flagship thing, and it would have been great. But yeah, the Hot Black, I'm not sure why they went with it. There are a lot of things that I like about it, but I don't know if it needed to be that big of a change. Mm-hmm. So, again, they steal a ship. It's identical ship to the one that the Admiral had, but this time it's Hot Black's, and it's his stunt ship. So when Ford tells Arthur that the ship they are on is the stunt ship and that they're going to crash into the sun, Arthur says, maybe there is something you can do with your towel. If you were a fan of the radio series back then and had not yet read the book and also listened to this to play at home, there's no mention of the towel. This is the only audio version of Towel that has appeared. It's very, very important in the book, but it's a little throwaway line with no reference here, and I just wondered if you had caught that.
I did. I caught the reference when I heard it, and I thought to myself the same thing. It's interesting because I didn't notice it in the LP. Did you?
This is the LP. It's not in the radio series.
So it's in the LP, but not in the radio series.
Yes.
Right. And I was trying to think back. I don't think, like you said, there were any other references to the towel or the use of a towel in the radio show or otherwise.
No, to quote Hitchhikers, there were none at all.
Exactly.
So yeah, I did find that to be strange. And I was just wondering how it got thrown in there. Possibly because it made the book, and this was probably recorded after the book. But if you only listened to the audio and never read the book, it wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah, do you think we need to find out? Because that seems to be a pretty glaring...
Find out what?
Step there. Well, we know that the radio show, at least the beginning of the radio show, was in 78, and the book didn't come out till 79. There was only 6 episodes here, and you would figure that these things are weekly or something like that. So if the whole process went over, of course, of 6 weeks, we're not talking about the book, so I don't know where the reference is.
The way I understand it in my head is that they did the radio series, and then he wrote the book. And then they did the re-recording of the radio series for the LP, but made changes that better matched the book. But they didn't add anything about the towel in the beginning of it. They just have this one line near the end.
Okay.
So that's how I believe it happened. So they're on the ship, and this is another one of those sign reading things. So they don't know what they're going to do. They can't control the ship. They're going to crash into the sun. Arthur asks, what does teleporter mean or whatever? And they're like, where do you see that? And he's like, well, under the words emergency and or what does he say? God, I messed that up. But because I didn't even write it down.
For emergency use only, I think?
Yeah, and then over the sign out of order. So there are 2 other signs and one is out of order. But they determine that it isn't totally out of order. It's just that you can't tell the teleporter where you want to go. It's just going to be random. And it can't be automatic. Somebody has to stay behind and operate it. In the exchange, Marvin did not volunteer. He just sort of said, you expect me to sacrifice myself so you can save yourselves. Mm-hmm. But if you remember, when he was being eaten in the other version, he's like, I just want to die. But in this version, he should still just want to die, so he should be happy to stay behind and crash into the sun. But he throws a guilt trip on them. And from this point on,
Right.
we follow Arthur and Ford, and we do not know what happened to Trillian and Zaphod or Marvin. At least they leave them alive to make it easier to later include them in the continuing story.
Correct.
Ford and Arthur teleported on to another spaceship. And again, I think this is all, like you were talking, the swirling field of improbability.
Correct. The vortex of improbability.
Yeah. The first thing they encounter is the cryogenic hold full of presumably dead hairdressers, account executives, and telephone sanitizers. Very shortly after that, again, they are promptly captured and escorted to the captain. Arthur says, "Why isn't anybody ever happy to see us?" But the captain is taking a bath, and he's been taking a bath for 3 years.
Right.
So they got escorted to the captain, and my favorite part of this whole bit is that number 2, who has captured them and has them as prisoners, is so excited because he's never had any prisoners before, and he wants to interrogate them. And the captain agrees to let him interrogate them, and he's like, ask them what they want to drink. And he did it like a drill sergeant, screaming every question at them. What do you want to drink? And he keeps asking them about like lemon or with ice. And then Ford asks about possibly getting some of those little cheesy crackers. And he's like, I'm the one asking the questions.
Around here. Exactly.
So the captain is telling them the story about why they're there on this ship. And they are from the planet Golgafrincham. Golgafrincham had a population problem, and they decided to solve it by ridding themselves of a useless third of their population. They built 3 ships. All the thinkers and scientists went into Ship A, and all the laborers and the people who actually do the work, they put in Ship C, and everybody else, all the middlemen type of things, in Ship B. Then they only sent off Ship B, which included the advertising executives and the marketing analysts and the telephone sanitizers.
Yeah, when they're mentioning the group of people that were put on to the B arc, this is where they do specifically mention advertising account executives and management consultants. And I always thought that was funny because this was a reference back to the first lines of the story we mentioned earlier, where all of Arthur's friends are in advertising.
Yes.
I just think it was funny.
Everybody on Golgafrincham went on to live happy and productive lives until they were all wiped out by a I'm not going to be able to say this. I am going to be incapable of saying.
Shall I say?
I think
virulent.
Yeah, so I think I will just say, and Bryan, what happened to the people of Golgafrincham?
Well, they were all wiped out by a virulent, what now?
a virulent disease brought on by a dirty telephone. But I can't.
Right. They were all wiped out by a virulent disease that was brought on by a dirty telephone.
Yes, they were. So I guess those telephone sanitizers were very, very necessary. All right. I'm not sure how much of that I'm going to edit out.
You might as well leave it all in.
Well, I'm going to leave a lot of it in, I think, because it's hysterical.
Yep. But I know you were going to get to it, but I'm going to jump ahead here a little. And I just think it's so funny where the captain is, of course, sitting in his bath and he's trying to recall or tell the story. And he says to Arthur and Ford, he says, it's nice to have someone else to talk to because when you're here all by yourself, then half the time you already know what you're going to talk about.
Half the time?
Yes. And then, of course, when they're discussing the reason why the B arc seems to be the only one that was leaving, they talk about the different disasters that were supposedly imminent on the planet. Of course, then they go on to that little story about how those disasters got orchestrated. But at the end, I believe it's Ford who screams out, "You're a load of useless bloody loonies."
That was the reason? Yeah, that's exactly. I knew there was a reason. That useless third they were told varying stories about why the planet was doomed. So it was going to be eaten by a giant space goat, or the moon was going to crash into it. The moon crashing into it. To me, that kind of sounds like Seven Eves. Are these similar stories?
Yes. Well, it happens to be, yes, coincidentally similar.
Is that a story about a bunch of useless bloody loonies?
I don't know. Something like that, yes.
Yeah. So, we're given a little taste of how inept the Golgafrinchams are at creating a society. They can't finish discovering fire because they need to decide how to market it. Like, do people want fire that can be fitted nasally? And that was all because Ford, in his just exasperation, told her to stick it up her nose. And so, she's like, yeah. They're also having difficulty discovering the wheel because they can't decide what color it should be. They're making documentaries about the dying off of the indigenous people. There is a line in one of the versions that says they need to stop selling them life insurance. So I'm guessing life insurance salesmen are all part of the useless bloody loonies.
Yeah, exactly.
And they're going to do a documentary about the captain, focusing on the burden of leadership and the loneliness of command. And the captain, again, still in his bath, tells him not to stress that last angle because...
Says one of my favorite lines, right?
Yeah. And what does he say?
One's never alone with a rubber duck.
Right. Again, my favorite line. Forget about the digital watches and the safe and the late. And
It's got to be about the rubber duck.
Oh, it's all about the rubber duck. They've also made leaves their currency. But everybody is very rich, but there's rampant inflation. And I think he uses the example of 3 deciduous forests equal ship's peanut. So they decide to go through an aggressive defoliation campaign to help revalue the leaf. And on the LP,
Correct.
They even declare a preemptive war on a neighboring area if anybody ever happens to live there. So now comes the big cliffhanger question. Since the Golgafrinchams landed on prehistoric Earth and all the indigenous cavemen have died out, the human race is now evolved from the Golgafrinchams and not the original indigenous people. So the program should have an error, and whatever question that Arthur might have in his brainwave pattern is most likely incorrect. They use the Scrabble board and just draw out random letters, and they get the question, what do you get when you multiply 6 by 9? So that leaves the question, is the program the Earth was running to find the question corrupted, or is this question somehow the real question? All right, so next time, Brian, I think I want to continue on with the radio series rather than going to the actual book. And we're going to do secondary phase, which is episodes 7 through 12.
Excellent. I look forward to it.
Yep, so do I. So, say goodbye, Brian.
Goodbye, Bryan.
Yeah, that was going to be... Thank you for listening to Digital Watches Are a Pretty Neat Idea. Look for us the first Thursday of every month for a new episode. A very special thanks goes out to Luke, Max, Greg, and Tim Lesnick for arranging and performing our opening theme. We would also like to thank our talented friends and family for their voice work on our introductions and commercials. For this episode, a special thank you to Carly Rounds for portraying 2/3 of Eccentrica Golumbus for our commercial. Visit our website at digitalwatchesarepretyneatidea.buzzsprout.com, where you can find links to all my Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy inspired t-shirt designs. You can find us on Facebook and YouTube as Digital Watches Are a Pretty Neat Idea, and on Twitter at WatchesIdea. If you'd like to contact us, our email is digitalwatchespodcast@gmail.com.
This has been a Fruits for Thought production.